Welcome to today's presentation on transition from first steps to early childhood special education, or ECSE. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has policies and procedures to ensure a smooth and effective transition from First Steps, or Part C, services to early childhood special education, or Part B services at age 3 for children with disabilities. First Steps is for children birth to age 3, and a copy of the state regulations can be viewed on your screen on the left-hand side. ECSE is Part B for children ages 3 to 5 years old, and a copy of the state regulations it can be viewed on the right-hand side of your screen. In today's presentation, we will address the following topics. Under Part 1 of the presentation, we'll talk about First Steps requirements, including notification to ECSE or opt-out if the family does not choose to go to ECSE, and transition plan and conference with ECSE. The second part of the presentation will switch over to ECSE requirements and talk about information related to children who participate in First Steps and transition to ECSE. To begin Part 1, we want to talk about the First Steps requirements related to transition. Transition from First Steps begins with service coordinators explaining First Step services end at age 3 and explaining to families any available community programs or other options for children after age 3. Some of the community programs that First Steps children transition to may include Head Start, local private or public preschool programs, child care settings, home-based care, and early childhood special education. Though children in First Steps may transition to a variety of programs, the purpose of this presentation is to talk specifically about transition from First Steps to ECSE. All First Steps children are potentially eligible for ECSE services. This means First Steps is required to notify ECSE when a child who's in First Steps is approaching age 3. Each year there are approximately 65 to 75% of our First Steps children who transition to ECSE. So planning for a successful transition from First Steps to ECSE is very important. The process of notification from First Steps to ECSE begins with the service coordinator explaining directory information to the family. Directory information is the following items: the child's name, the child's date of birth, the parent's name, the parent's address, and the parent's phone number. This includes any documentation if the family does not have a phone number. If one or more of the 5 directory items listed is not provided when First Steps communicates with ECSE, then the directory information is not complete and notification to ECSE does not occur. However, once all 5 items are shared with ECSE, then directory information is complete and notification to ECSE has occurred. It's important to know that directory information may be provided in any manner. This might include notification when the transition plan meeting occurs, in an email from the service coordinator, in a phone call from the parent, in the child's IFSP. The notification may also occur in sharing directory information all at once or over several contacts. It may also occur if it's from anyone with knowledge of the child in First Steps. Because there's a variety of ways that directory information can be shared, it is best practice to send directory information to ECSE in a written format. Then the documentation of all 5 complete directory information items is clear. To help remind us of the timeline for notification, First Steps must send directory information to ECSE at certain times. It's depending upon the status of the child in First Steps. For example, if the child is determined eligible for First Steps 90 days or more before the child's third birthday, then directory information must be sent from First Steps to ECSE at least 90 days prior to the child's third birthday. Another example of sending directory information is if the child is determined eligible for First Steps less than 90 days, but 45 days or more before the child's third birthday, then directory information is sent to ECSE as soon as possible after the child's determined eligible for First Steps. A third example is if the child is referred to First Steps less than 45 days before the child's third birthday, then First Steps can only send directory information if the parent has signed a release of information to share with ECSE. In Missouri, we have an opt-out policy in First Steps. This means the parents have a specified time period to object to the notification to ECSE. Parents can request that directory information not be shared with ECSE. The service coordinator has to explain the opt-out policy to parents when preparing to schedule the transition plan meeting. Unless the parent has requested information be shared with ECSE before planning the transition meeting. Approximately 5% of First Steps parents will opt out of sharing directory information. Therefore, ECSE can expect to receive directory information from most children who are exiting First Steps. If the parent does not choose to send directory information to ECSE, the service coordinator informs the parent that failure to notify ECSE 90 days or more before the child's third birthday may result in a gap in services between First Steps and ECSE. To opt out of directory information sent to ECSE, parents must sign the opt-out form and return the form to the service coordinator no later than the transition plan meeting. Please refer to the opt-out form in the presentation handouts. The opt-out form can also be found on the First Steps website on the Transition First Steps to ECSE page. If the parents do not opt out in writing by the transition plan meeting, then directory information will be sent to ECSE at the transition plan meeting. There may be times that the parents first opt out of sending directory information to ECSE and then later change their minds. In this case, the service coordinator must have the parents complete the reversal of opt-out section of the opt-out form. Once the parent has signed the reversal section, the service coordinator must send the form to ECSE as soon as possible. In First Steps, we refer to late referrals for children who enter First Steps at the same time the transition process should be beginning. A late referral is a child who is referred to First Steps less than 135 days before the child's third birthday. You might be wondering why 135 days was selected for late referrals. 135 is 90 days for the transition timeline requirement plus 45 days for the referral processing requirement for First Steps, and that's how 135 days was completed for a late referral. The timeline for notification to ECSE for late referrals is if the child is found eligible for first steps less than 90 but 45 days or more before the child's third birthday. The service coordinator must provide the local school district with directory information as soon as possible after the child is determined eligible for first steps, unless the parent opts out. Sometimes parents of children who are referred late to First Steps request an ECSE referral before First Steps eligibility has been determined. In this case, the timeline for notification to ECSE is if the child was referred to First Steps less than 45 days before the child's third birthday or any time the child's eligibility for First Steps is not known. First Steps must have written parental consent, that is, a release of information, before the service coordinator can contact ECSE. In either situation, if the child's referred less than 45 days before the third birthday or at any time the child's eligibility is not known, the parent can make a referral directly to ECSE or the service coordinator can refer the child on the parent's behalf if there's a signed release of information. Those two situations may look different in how the child's referred to ECSE. As an example, if a child's referred to First Steps shortly before the third birthday, the service coordinator is talking to the parent, maybe on the telephone, and the parent is interested in ECSE. It might be faster for the service coordinator to give the parent ECSE contact information and encourage the parent to call ECSE directly. On the other hand, the service coordinator may be in the family's home for an intake visit and the parent's interested in ECSE. In this case, the service coordinator can use a release of information, have the parent sign the release of information form to share certain information with ECSE. Then the service coordinator can refer the child to ECSE on the parent's behalf. In either situation, it's appropriate to refer the child to ECSE if the parent is interested in those services. Two key takeaway points for notification. If a child is eligible for First Steps, the child is also potentially eligible for ECSE. First Steps is required to send directory information to ECSE at least 90 days before the child's third birthday, unless the parent opts out. On the other hand, if a child's eligibility for First Steps is unknown, yet the parent requests to be referred to ECSE, written parental consent must be obtained before sending any information to ECSE because we don't know if the child's eligible for First Steps. This means the service coordinator must receive a signed release of information from the parent before information can be shared. In preparing for transition meetings in First Steps, there are two types of meetings. One is a transition plan, and one is a transition conference with ECSE. The transition plan is an IFSP meeting held for all children participating in First Steps. On the other hand, the transition conference with ECSE is an IFSP meeting held with ECSE if the parent agrees to invite ECSE. These two meetings can be combined into one meeting by inviting ECSE to develop the transition plan. So if the parent wants ECSE to come to the first transition meeting, which is the transition plan, then the service coordinator can prepare for a transition plan and conference combination. However, if the parent doesn't want ECSE in the transition meeting, the service coordinator is preparing for a transition plan meeting and no conference with ECSE. The transition plan and the transition conference with ECSE are both IFSP meetings. This means the First Step Service Coordinator must complete all required IFSP meeting activities. Each transition meeting must include the IFSP requirements depending upon the type of the IFSP meeting. For example, if the service coordinator is having an initial IFSP meeting that's also a transition, there's certain requirements that would be different than if the service coordinator is holding the transition meeting in conjunction with an annual IFSP meeting, a 6-month review IFSP meeting, or an interperiodic IFSP meeting. Let's first talk about the transition plan and the required participants at this meeting. The purpose of the transition plan meeting is to discuss the steps and services for a successful transition out of First Steps. The required participants at the transition plan meeting are the parents and the service coordinator. Other participants at the meeting may include family members or other persons outside of the family as requested by the parent, persons who conducted the evaluation or assessment of the child, and service providers who are serving the child and family as appropriate. Participants may attend the IFSP meeting, the transition plan meeting, in person or other ways, such as by report, by conference call, or by substitute.
The transition section in the Transition Plan IFSP must include certain documentation of the steps and services for a smooth transition. These requirements include 5 steps. First, a discussion of program options for the child after First Steps. Second, procedures to prepare the child for a new setting and adjust to new services after First Steps. Third, the transition activities necessary for the remainder of the child's time in First Steps. Fourth, confirmation that complete directory information was shared with ECSE by the transition plan meeting, or confirmation the parent opted out. And number 5, with a signed release of information, confirmation any additional information was shared with ECSE, again by the transition plan meeting. This includes a copy of the most recent evaluation and assessments and the last IFSP. Of note, the service coordinator must document these 5 steps in the transition plan IFSP. In order to document the 2 confirmations listed in steps 4 and 5, either the parent must opt out or the parent must agree to send directory information on or before the transition plan IFSP meeting.
The timeline for the transition plan is the plan must be held not fewer than 90 days and at the discretion of all parties not more than 9 months before the child's 3rd birthday. The transition plan can be combined with a required First Steps initial, 6-month, or annual IFSP meeting if the timelines permit. Or, if an IFSP review is not due, the transition plan may be held as an interperiodic meeting. To prepare for a transition meeting, the service coordinator must ask whether the parent wants to include ECSE in the meeting. If the parent wants to include ECSE in the meeting, an invitation to a transition meeting may be sent to ECSE without sharing complete directory information. That is, ECSE would receive one or more of the directory information pieces, but not all 5 directory information pieces. Before First Steps can share information except for directory information, the parents must sign a release of information indicating what additional information can be shared with ECSE.
It's best practice to have the release of information form signed by the parent prior to the date of the meeting with ECSE. However, the parent must sign the release of information form before the transition meeting begins. Once the parent signs a release of information and the information identified in that release is shared, for example, the child's IFSP is shared, either verbally or in writing, complete directory information has been shared. Remember, sharing complete directory information constitutes a referral to ECSE. So this means if complete directory information was not shared before the transition meeting, once the parent signs the release of information form to ECSE and the meeting begins, then a referral has been made to ECSE. An IFSP note. The MOSIS ID numbers are assigned to children while in First Steps. Page 1 of the IFSP contains each child's MOSIS ID number. When a child transitions from First Steps to ECSE, that MOSIS ID number stays with the child. So ECSE needs to be sure to use that MOSIS ID number that's on the IFSP in their district student information system.
Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the transition conference with ECSE. The purpose of the transition conference is to provide information about ECSE to the parents of a child in First Steps. The required participants at the transition conference with ECSE are representative from ECSE, the parents, and the service coordinator. This means scheduling the transition conference must include ECSE in order to ensure their attendance at the meeting. Other participants may include family members or other persons outside of the family as requested by the parent, persons who conducted the evaluation or assessment in First Steps, and First Step service providers as appropriate. The requirements at the transition conference include section in the IFSP that must have documentation of a discussion of the differences between First Steps and ECSE, a description of the ECSE eligibility process, and the contact information for ECSE. The timelines for the transition conference with ECSE are the meeting must be held not fewer than 90 days and at the discretion of all parties not more than 9 months before the child's 3rd birthday. A quick note about at the discretion of all parties. This means that the required meeting participants must be involved in scheduling. Every effort should be made by both First Steps and ECSE to have ECSE present at the transition conference. This may mean First Steps attempts to schedule the conference prior to the district's dismissal for summer in order to make sure ECSE can participate. That is acceptable to schedule the meeting before or after the summer break, as long as it's held within the timelines for a First Steps transition conference. Though it should be rare, if ECSE planned to participate but was unable to do so, the service coordinator must reschedule the transition conference if timelines permit, because ECSE is a required member at this meeting. There are several options for holding the transition conference. With parent permission, the service coordinator invites ECSE to the transition plan meeting, and then the meeting is a combination plan and conference. When holding a combined meeting, remember the requirements for both the plan and the conference that was just described must be met. On the other hand, if the parent did not agree to invite ECSE to the transition plan meeting, the service coordinator conducts the transition plan meeting with the parent and any other invited participants. If the parent later decides to have a conference with ECSE, then the service coordinator must hold another separate meeting, which would be the transition conference with ECSE. Let's review the meeting timelines for First Steps transition meetings. The earliest the transition plan and conference with ECSE can be held is 9 months prior to the child's 3rd birthday. The latest the transition plan and conference with ECSE can be held is 90 days prior to the 3rd birthday. Best practice is to hold the transition plan and transition conference with ECSE together in one combined meeting in order to alleviate the need to meet twice during this window of time. It's also best practice to hold the transition plan and conference meetings between 6 months prior to the child's 3rd birthday and 120 days prior to the child's 3rd birthday. You might be wondering why the best practice window was selected from 6 months to 120 days before the child's 3rd birthday. Scheduling the meeting in this window helps align with the referral timelines for ECSE, which is 120 days prior to the child's 3rd birthday. We'll talk more about the ECSE timeline next. Another recap in the timeline for late referrals and first steps is children who are referred less than 135 days but 90 days or more prior to the child's 3rd birthday. In this event, the transition plan and the transition conference with ECSE must be held as part of the initial IFSP meeting. If the child is referred to first steps less than 90 but 45 days or more before the child's 3rd birthday, then the transition plan must be held as part of the initial IFSP, but a transition conference with ECSE is not required. If the child is referred to first steps less than 45 days from the child's 3rd birthday, the transition plan and a transition conference with ECSE are not required. Finally, takeaway points for the transition plan and the transition conference with ECSE. All children in First Steps must have a transition plan IFSP meeting no later than 90 days before the child's 3rd birthday. This means every child in First Steps will have a transition plan meeting. But parent permission is needed before a transition conference with ECSE can be held. With parent permission, a transition conference is held no later than 90 days prior to the child's 3rd birthday. As mentioned earlier, there are specific discussions and activities required at the transition plan meeting and at the transition conference with ECSE. These discussions and activities must be documented in the IFSP. And finally, the transition plan and the transition conference with ECSE may be combined into one meeting in order to alleviate separate meetings in a short period of time.
The second part of our presentation will address the transition from Part C to Part B from the perspective of the Part B ECSE program. We will specifically be addressing the referral process when an LEA receives a first step referral, the requirements for ECSE at the First Steps Transition Conference, timelines for evaluation, eligibility determination, and when the IEP must be in place by the child's 3rd birthday. We will also be introducing a new flowchart and worksheet to assist LEAs to effectively and efficiently meet compliance requirements related to the smooth transition from Part C to Part B. It's important to note that because of the significant delays that must be documented for eligibility into the First Steps programs, all First Steps children are considered potentially eligible for ECSE services in Missouri. First Steps is required to notify ECSE when a child participating in First Steps is approaching age 3. This notification assists ECSE to comply with child find requirements, as well as the requirements associated with the transition between Part C, First Steps, and Part B, the ECSE programs. Note that ECSE is required to respond to notification by processing the notification as a parent referral for an initial special education evaluation. Notification occurs when complete directory information, and if you remember, that includes the child's name, the child's birth date, the parent's name, the parent's address, and the phone number, if there is one, is received by the LEA. It's very important to remember that once complete directory information is received by the LEA, notification has occurred and a referral to ECSE has been made and must be responded to appropriately. This slide makes it very clear that no matter what we are calling it, directory, information, notification, it all equals a referral to ECSE and must be responded to appropriately. This is a screenshot of a new resource to help school districts more efficiently and effectively meet compliance requirements for children in First Steps to transition smoothly to the ECSE program. This new resource is a handout for this webinar and can also be located on the Special Education Compliance webpage under Model Forms. Note the first section allows the school district to document the directory information, while the second section provides a place to document timeline information. The third section is a flow chart that will assist ECSE staff in determining and following the correct timeline and meeting compliance requirements related to eligibility determination and IEP development.
Remember, 90 is the key number to remember when making a compliance decision for whether an IEP must be developed by the child's third birthday. So, for all children referred to First Steps at least 90 days prior to the child's third birthday, and if they are subsequently determined eligible for First Steps, and if they are found eligible for ECSE, then the IEP must be developed by the child's third birthday. So in other words, referred to First Steps greater than or equal to 90 days, plus eligible for First Steps, plus eligible for ECSE equals IEP developed by the child's third birthday. However, there are 3 exceptions for First Steps referral to ECSE to not have an IEP developed by the child's third birthday. First, the child was referred to First Steps less than 90 days prior to the child's third birthday. Second, the parent refuses to provide consent for the initial ECSE evaluation to determine eligibility. In this situation, ECSE must document attempts to obtain parental consent for the initial evaluation. And according to procedural safeguards, ECSE should be keeping a record of written correspondence sent, of phone calls made and responses to those calls, as well as any visits made to the parent's home or place of employment and the results of those visits. And third, the parent initially opts out of the First Step notification and subsequently changes their minds less than 90 days prior to the child's third birthday. School districts will receive the opt-out reversal information and should attach it to the new First Steps referral to ECSE documentation form as a way to document why the IEP was not in place by the child's third birthday for compliance purposes. Please note that if the parent subsequently changes their minds 90 days or more prior to the child's third birthday, the IEP must still be in place by the child's third birthday if eligible for ECSE. This is because of the the compliance requirement that eligibility must be determined by the child's third birthday, and if eligible, the child must have an IEP in place by their third birthday. With the 90 days, you have 30 days to determine whether you suspect the child has a disability, and you have 60 days to determine the eligibility. So that is why that 90 days is really the key to the whole situation.
ECSE must collaborate with the First Steps Service Coordinator in planning a transition conference several weeks in advance to find a meeting date, time, and place that works for the parent, ECSE staff, and the service coordinator. When invited, ECSE must participate in the transition conference even if the date and time is outside of the regular school calendar. This is a compliance requirement. Participation in the transition conference means ECSE attends the meeting in person or participates via another method, such as a conference call or Skype. Next, we will talk more about each of the individual parts of this ECSE evaluation process and timeline. Please refer to the webinar handout, Initial Evaluation Process Parent Referral Flowchart, as a reference. This flowchart can also be found on the Department's Special Education Compliance webpage under Model Forms. It's important to remember that the special education evaluation process is divided into the following components. The first 30 days are the allowable 30 days from the date of referral to determine if a disability is suspected and the date the parent is provided with a notice of action, or NOA, with either proposing or refusing an evaluation. The next 60 days are the allowable 60 days from the date of the notice of action or consent to evaluate until the date the evaluation is complete and eligibility for special education is determined. The final 30 days are the allowable 30 days from the date of the eligibility determination until the date of the IEP meeting for the development of an IEP. This timeline is often referred to as the 30-60-30 timeline by Part B or by Early Childhood Special Ed. The first 30 days of the timeline is used for ECSE to determine if there is a reason to suspect the child has a disability and may be in need of special education and related services. This determination is made by district staff following the district's procedures and practices. The district determination always ends with the parent being provided with a notice of action describing the decision and its rationale. This screenshot is of the evaluation process, initial evaluation process parent referral flowchart, and you can follow the steps to see what needs to be done. If the LEA suspects the child may be a child with a disability in need of special education and related services, a review of existing data, or RED, must be conducted. This slide shows some of the considerations for conducting a RED for a child transitioning from First Steps. First, ECSE must have received the referral before the transition conference in order to conduct the RED at the First Steps Transition Conference. Next, if ECSE intends to do the RED at the transition conference, ECSE must inform the parent of their intent beforehand through the meeting notification process and comply with the timelines for ECSE meeting notifications. And finally, if ECSE does not intend to conduct the RED at the transition conference, it is acceptable to confer with appropriate school staff and the parent following the transition conference to conduct the RED without a meeting. This 60-day timeline begins when parent consent is obtained. Parent consent is always required for an initial evaluation, regardless of whether or not additional data is to be collected through an educational evaluation. No later than the end of the 60 days, eligibility must be determined. Children ages 3 through 5 who are not kindergarten age eligible can be found eligible under any of the categorical disabilities such as autism, speech impairment, language impairment, intellectual disability, etc. Remember, this is the only group of students that can meet the eligibility criteria for the category of young child with a developmental delay. Note that an evaluation report is required at the end of this process regardless of whether the child is found eligible or not. Again, this is a screenshot of our flowchart, and that will help LEAs to follow the process. It's important to remember that there are acceptable extensions allowed during the first 30 and the next 60 days in the evaluation timeline. This slide describes these situations in terms of following the 30-60-30 evaluation timeline or for following a compressed timeline. It's extremely important to know how to calculate which timeline ECSE must follow in order to remain in compliance. So let's start with the 30-60-30 timeline. For children in first steps referred to ECSE greater than 120 days prior to their third birthday, ECSE must follow two separate timeline requirements. First is the 30-60-30 timeline. Note that 30 plus 60 plus 30 equals the 120 days, which is why this timeline must be followed. Snow days, agency vacation days, the child's absence because of illness, and summer breaks are all acceptable extensions to the first 30 and the next 60 days in this timeline. The second timeline that these children have to follow is the IEP in place by the child's third birthday timeline. There are no acceptable extensions beyond the child's third birthday for an IEP to be developed, even when following the 30-60-30 timeline with acceptable extensions. Now let's address when a child is referred to first steps greater than 90 days and referred to ECSE less than 120 days prior to the child's third birthday. The full 30-60-30 timeline is not available to use, and thus a compressed timeline must be followed in order for the child to have eligibility determined and an IEP developed by the child's third birthday if appropriate. Again, there are no acceptable extensions for an IEP to be developed by the child's third birthday in this situation. Once eligibility has been determined, there must be no more than a 30 days lapse before the IEP is developed. Again, there are no acceptable delays to this part of the timeline. This means that if the 30-day period to develop the IEP falls during a vacation period, the IEP must still meet. Often the timeline is shortened, and that is acceptable for IEPs to be developed immediately after ECSE eligibility determination in order to reduce the number of meetings that the parent must attend. ECSE must follow their IEP meeting notification requirements in this situation. According to Part B regulations, the parent of a child previously served in first steps is informed of his or her rights to request the service coordinator or other representative of the First Steps program to be invited to the initial IEP meeting to assist with the smooth transition of services. One of the most common reasons LEAs are found out of compliance related to the transition between First Steps and ECSE relates to acceptable extensions during the summer months when school districts are on summer break. Just to be clear, let's clarify what is an acceptable extension as related to school district summer break. It's important to remember that summer break is an acceptable extension for the first 30 and the next 60 days when following the 30-60-30 timeline. This means the clock may stop for school vacations during the first 30 days or the next 60-day evaluation period. However, once the eligibility determination has been made, there is no acceptable extension to the final 30 days of the timeline to develop the IEP. This means that if the last 30-day period to develop the IEP falls during a vacation period, the IEP team must still meet and develop an IEP for the child no later than 30 days from the date of the eligibility determination.
To summarize, let's take a look at the takeaway points for the ECSE portion of this presentation. Key point 1. There are no exceptions to the referral date. The date ECSE picks up the fax, receives the email, or talks to someone on the phone. That's the date of referral. School districts cannot have a conflicting rule that delays the processing of referrals, including referrals made by First Steps on behalf of the parent. Key point 2. First Step referrals must follow the initial evaluation process and meet the 30-60-30 timeline requirements unless the timeline is compressed for the IEP to be in place by the third birthday for First Steps eligible children referred to First Steps greater than 90 days prior to the child's third birthday. Again, there are no exceptions.
Now let's take some time to look at 3 common scenarios and how to determine if the child must have an IEP in place by their third birthday. First, the date of referral to First Steps is a key piece of information needed to be able to make this determination. Remember that this date is not included in directory information. ECSE has 2 possible means of obtaining this information. The first is to look at the date on page 1 of the First Steps Release of Information form. The second is to ask the parent and the First Step Service Coordinator at the transition conference. And once this date is known, use the First Steps Referral to ECSE documentation form to determine the evaluation timeline to follow for children transitioning for First Steps in order to find out if the IEP has to be in place by the third birthday. So let's take a look at each of the 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1 is Michael. Michael has been in First Steps for a while. His parents first opted out and then changed their mind. Separate transition plan and transition conference meetings were held. A referral was made to ECSE greater than 120 days prior to the child's third birthday. Using the new First Steps to ECSE documentation form to determine the answers to the following questions. Was Michael referred to First Steps 90 days or more before his third birthday? Was Michael referred to ECSE 90 days or more before his third birthday? Does ECSE follow the 30-60-30 timeline or a compressed timeline? Can there be acceptable extensions? And if eligible for ECSE, does the IEP have to be in place by Michael's third birthday? This slide shows how to document and use the first steps to ECSE worksheet to determine the answers to those questions, and if the IEP must be in place by the third birthday for a child referred to First Steps more than 120 days prior to the child's third birthday. The yellow highlights indicate that Michael was referred to First Steps greater than 90 days prior to his third birthday, requiring ECSE to determine if Michael was referred to ECSE less than 120 days prior to his third birthday. The green highlights show that Michael was not referred less than 120 days prior to his third birthday, and thus would follow the 30-60-30 evaluation timeline. If eligible, Michael's IEP would need to be developed within 30 days of the eligibility determination, and even with acceptable extensions no later than his third birthday. So here are the answers for Michael. Was Michael referred to First Steps 90 days or more before his third birthday? Yes, he was referred 365 days before his third birthday. Was Michael referred to ECSE 90 days or more before his third birthday? Yes, he was referred 131 days. Does ECSE follow the 30-60-30 timeline or a compressed timeline? And can there be acceptable extensions? The LEA would follow the 30-60-30 timeline for Michael, and yes, the clock may stop for breaks or acceptable extensions. If eligible for ECSE, does the IEP have to be in place by Michael's third birthday? Yes, and within the timelines. In summary, for a child in First Steps referred to ECSE greater than 120 days before the third birthday, ECSE must follow the 30-60-30 timeline. If eligible for ECSE, an IEP must be developed within 120 days unless parent delays consent to evaluate. It is acceptable for the IEP to be developed before the child's third birthday and then implemented on the child's third birthday. Let's look at another situation. This is scenario 2, and it refers to Elaine. Elaine was referred to First Steps 94 days before her third birthday and referred to ECSE less than 90 days after First Steps eligibility was determined, using the model form to determine the answers to the following questions. Was Elaine referred to First Steps 90 days or more before her third birthday? Was Elaine referred to ECSE 90 days or more before her third birthday? Does ECSE follow the 30-60-30 timeline or a compressed timeline? And if eligible for ECSE, does the IEP have to be in place by the third birthday? So let's look at what the worksheet shows. This slide shows how to document and use the First Steps to ECSE worksheet to determine if the IEP must be in place by the third birthday for a child referred to First Steps a little more than 90 days prior to the child's third birthday, but less than 120 days prior to the child's third birthday. The yellow highlights indicate that Elaine was referred to First Steps greater than 90 days prior to her third birthday, requiring ECSE to determine if Elaine was referred to ECSE less than the 120 days prior to her third birthday. The green highlights show that Elaine was referred less than 120 days prior to her third birthday, and thus the LEA would be required to follow a compressed evaluation timeline. If eligible, Elaine's IEP would need to be developed no later than her third birthday. So let's answer the questions for Elaine. Was Elaine referred to First Steps 90 days or more prior to her third birthday? Yes, she was referred 94 days prior to her third birthday. Was Elaine referred to ECSE 90 days or more before her third birthday? That answer is no. She was only referred 63 days prior to her third birthday. Does ECSE follow the 30-60-30 timeline? No, they must follow the compressed timeline. If eligible for ECSE, does the IEP have to be in place by Elaine's 3rd birthday? And the answer is yes. Eligibility must be determined and the IEP must be in place by Elaine's 3rd birthday, which is why it has to be a compressed timeline, because there's not enough time to give the full 30-60-30 timeline. In summary, a child referred to First Steps a little more than 90 days before the 3rd birthday and subsequently determined eligible for First Steps, regardless of when referred to ECSE, if they are eligible, an IEP must be developed by the 3rd birthday. The evaluation process timeline will need to be compressed. And the final scenario involves Jack. Jack was referred to First Steps 84 days before his 3rd birthday. He was referred to ECSE after an eligibility determination was made for First Steps. Since Jack was referred to First Steps less than 90 days before his 3rd birthday, First Steps is not required to conduct a transition conference with ECSE. Use the model form to answer the following questions. Was Jack referred to First Steps 90 days or more before his 3rd birthday? Was Jack referred to ECSE 90 days or more before his 3rd birthday? Does ECSE follow the 30-60-30 timeline or a compressed timeline? And if eligible, does the IEP have to be in place by the child's 3rd birthday? This slide shows how to document the information for Jack, and specifically how to determine if an IEP must be in place by the child's 3rd birthday for a child referred to First Steps less than 90 days prior to the child's 3rd birthday. The blue highlight indicates that Jack was referred to First Steps less than 90 days prior to his 3rd birthday. Following the flow chart, the 30-60-30 timeline would be followed for Jack. The green highlight shows that Jack was referred less than 120 days prior to his 3rd birthday. However, since he was referred to First Steps less than 90 days prior to his 3rd birthday, the standard 30-60-30 timeline would be followed. If eligible, Jack's IEP would need to be developed no later than 30 days after the eligibility determination. Here are the answers to Jack's questions. Was Jack referred to First Steps 90 days or more before his 3rd birthday? No, he was referred only 84 days prior. Was Jack referred to ECSE 90 days or more before his 3rd birthday? No, he was only referred 57 days to ECSE. Does ECSE follow the 30-60-30 timeline or a compressed timeline? In this situation, they follow the 30-60-30 timeline. And if eligible for ECSE, does the IEP have to be in place by the child's 3rd birthday? And the answer to that is no. A child referred to First Steps less than 90 days before the 3rd birthday, regardless of First Steps eligibility, and when referred to ECSE, ECSE must follow the 30-60-30 timeline. An IEP does not have to be in place or developed by the child's 3rd birthday in this situation.
We're watching the presentation on transition from Part C First Steps to Part B ECSE. If you have additional questions, please contact the Office of Childhood at the contacts listed on your screen. Thank you.